The chair of this session is Dr. Masuma Hasan, the chairperson of the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs, Karachi. The session is going to focus on people on the move. Dr. Eric Shahzar, lecturer, Department of Law and Politics, University of Hertfordshire, United Kingdom. He is going to speak on environmental degradation and forced displacement in South Asia. Syed Shahzar, researcher, the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs. He is going to shed a light on the displacement as a weapon, the politics of forced migration in the MENA region. Dr. Arjumand Bazon Kazmi, postdoctoral fellow, Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law, University of Oslo, Norway, and Dr. Maja Janmer, professor, Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law, University of Oslo, Norway. So over to you, Madam Masuma.
So 15 minutes each, and because there is a joint presentation, so we can make it 20 minutes. Since I won't usurp much of my time as chair, and we'll go straight into the presentation. So I request Eric Shahzar.
Right, so let's begin. So thanks very much, Dr. Masuma, for the introduction. So thanks very much to the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs for organizing this wonderful two-day conference. My profession is teaching, but I'm not here to deliver a lecture. I'm here to talk about people on the move, as you can see in the theme in the booklet. And my topic for the presentation is forced climate displacement and ecological disruption. Now, today and even yesterday, we had many progressive debates and discussions about Bandung, its history, the spirit, its courage. I won't go in depth with the Bandung spirit, but I'll connect it with my presentation in the next few minutes, and I'll jump straight to my topic. So, the theme of my discussion will be climate displacement in South Asia, and more broadly in the global South. It is a living reality right now. It's not something which we will face in the future. It's something which we are tackling right now as we speak. I believe climate displacement, climate crisis, it's one of the most pressing issues which we're facing today. Displacement, it breaks lives silently, steadily. Sometimes it doesn't see the light of the day. It's not in the headlines, just as the genocides which the panelists previously mentioned. I'll show some examples on how the poor and the marginalized are the ones who suffer the most because of displacement we see today. So just to set the foundations of my presentation, I'm going to talk about some facts, some statistics about climate displacement in South Asia, in the global South. Facts and statistics will give us some perspective about where the trends are heading. So when I talk about, you must have heard climate change, but my focus would be on displacement. And I'm going to talk about some displacement drivers, such as rising sea levels, fast rising sea levels. I'm going to talk about flash floods. I'm going to talk about extreme droughts. I'm going to talk about heat waves. All of these issues are clear scientific evidence of the climate displacement crisis we see today. And I also want to talk about something very important, that the climate displacement crisis, it heavily interacts with genocide, it interacts with war, persecution. It actually fuels all of these factors which I've talked about. Now, just to set some momentum about some statistics about displacement, I'm going to talk about the Indus Delta. Let's start with Pakistan. We have the Indus Delta, life-giving Indus Delta in the south. If you sometimes just Google Indus Delta, you'll see it's in the Arabian Sea, next to India, beautiful sight. When I was conducting my ground research for climate displacement, I went there twice, and I've seen horrific scenes down there. For my doctorate, I have to, of course, conduct some primary research. I took interviews, I took surveys, but what struck me the most was this interview with this 80-year-old individual. He mentioned that he had to change his profession in the last 2 decades. And I was slightly surprised that, and I asked this question, why did you have to change your profession? And he mentioned that just because the Indus Delta, the life-giving Indus Delta, it's in peril, it's dying, I had to change my profession from a farmer to a fisherman. Because for farming to thrive, you need fresh water availability, right? And with fast rising sea levels, it takes over the land and people have to change their profession. I'll quickly talk about Bangladesh now, since the theme of my presentation is on South Asia and the global South broadly. More than 1,000 climate migrants are making their way in Dhaka, which is one of the most dense cities in the world. And as I said, dense populated city in the world, and it's already facing a big refugee crisis connected with the Rohingya crisis, of course. And I just want to add one important point here is that the displacement crisis, the climate displacement crisis, heavily interacts with economic and political instability as well. Let's talk about India now. India, in the next couple of decades, will have around 45 million climate migrants internally. I'm saying internally. I'm not saying people from Bangladesh or neighboring countries will go there. I'm talking about internal displacement in India, 45 million. That's a big number. So while I'm doing some research on climate migration in South Asia, I was talking to some of my colleagues in England, and we were in agreement that India should also focus more on tackling its climate migration crisis rather than waging war with its neighbors. Karachi, the city we are in actually, in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, these are just projections, and the numbers are going to quadruple or exacerbate in the future. In Karachi, we'll have more than 3 million climate migrants coming from all over Pakistan, and more so from the southern belt, Katy Bandar, near the Arabian Sea, which I mentioned a few minutes ago. Last important fact, let's take a step back from South Asia now. Last fact which I want to share is from Somalia. I was conducting some climate migration patterns with the University of Oxford last year, and there was some scientific evidence which suggests that 1 degree temperature rise leads to 1,000% rise in climate displacement. I repeat this point, this is very, very important. A 1 degree temperature rise creates 1,000% rise in climate migrants. I think that's a very shocking number. And that's not just relevant for Somalia, but I think that's an across-the-board issue, globally speaking. Now, Somalia and Sudan was mentioned previously in the first session. I also believe that the displacement crisis which we see is fueling genocide, it's fueling persecution, right? Because when there are limited resources, right, people fight for natural resources. And that's where climate crisis becomes more and more pressing. And also, I believe that the impact is beyond physical as well. We're seeing loss of culture. We're seeing an identity crisis, right? As people move, as islands disappear, cultures are disappearing, identities are disappearing as well, right? And it just highlights some massive governance failures across the boards. And I also want to link mental health issues with the climate displacement crisis, right? When you're living in a particular location for so many decades, right? As the 80-year-old individual which I interviewed, and when they're being told that you have to move, people are on the move, it takes a big mental toll, right? So the displacement crisis leads to many mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and inevitably suicide as well. So all of these are very important and serious issues. Now, we've had many progressive discussions about the Bandung spirit, its courage, its bravery. Yesterday, it was also highlighted that the Bandung spirit might be dead. I won't go on and say that the spirit is dead, right? I would say it's struggling. I would say it's in trouble, but I still think that it can be revived. The spirit can be used to revive some collaboration within South Asia and the global South specifically. The region has the experience, it knows about the urgency, it has local knowledge to collaborate to tackle the displacement crisis, right? So pandemics, terrorism, diseases, all of these are borderless challenges, and we need coordinated forums such as this one to discuss these important issues. Now, this is the progressive debate about the Bandung courage and the conference which we had a few decades ago. I highlighted that it's not dead, but it's struggling, right? Why is it struggling? It is because of the international political arena we live in today. And I just want to quote Professor John Mersheimer here from the University of Chicago, proper realist. He mentioned about how we live in an anarchic world system, right? In which there's an absence of global government, right? And countries are there to fight among each other. In a nutshell, he said that. Now, while the UN has, been doing amazing stuff, which I believe it has been successful in many fronts, right? In COVID-19, the World Food Programme achieved the Nobel Prize to solve the food crisis in many global South regions. However, there's some failures of the United Nations as well, which I think it's all over the news, right? I don't need to highlight the case studies, starting from Gaza to Yemen to Sudan. So these are the problems which the international political arena is facing. And I think yesterday, Senator Sherry focused very nicely on self-help. So not just relying on external factors, external countries. I think it's very important to also focusing on self-help, right? Helping ourselves first. I think resilience must start from within. Resilient countries create resilient policies. And I think that's something which South Asian countries should consider. Now, I've talked about some facts and statistics about the displacement crisis. I've linked the Bandung spirit with this topic. Now I'm going to talk about some legal gaps when it comes to climate migrants. And I'm going to talk about the international convention behind displacement. So you must be aware about the 1951 Refugee Convention, which I think the panelists are going to talk about it in the next few minutes. South Asian countries are not signatories of the Refugee Convention. I think the only country is Afghanistan. Other than Afghanistan, no South Asian country in the region is part of the Refugee Convention. And there's a big debate if the Refugee Convention should be expanded and climate refugees should also be protected. Historically, the Refugee Convention has been amazing, it's been brilliant, in which at the time of its creation, but now there is a gap. The question is, should the Refugee Convention be expanded? I strongly believe that the global political will is lacking when it comes to expanding the Refugee Convention. We've seen anti-immigration waves in all over the world, not just in the West, right? In the United Kingdom, we've seen Brexit taking place, right? We've heard about Trump's Mexican wall. We've talked about many European countries making it difficult for people from the global south to enter in their countries because of political tensions, the cost of living crisis in these countries. They're not accepting people, so why would they accept climate refugees, for now, at least? So I think for South Asia and the global south, it's very important to not just rely on Western-centric frameworks, but they should focus more on regional and national mechanisms to actually work on the displacement crisis. I've written a policy brief for the Jinnah Institute recently, and the World Economic Forum has also published this policy brief. I've given some policy recommendations on how governments, policymakers can make impact, not just making rhetoric, symbolic legislation, but actually helping people on the move. I've talked about how national governments must invest in data, in AI, for instance. I'm an academic in the United Kingdom. There is a big problem about students using AI and ChatGPT. There was this report by The Guardian a few weeks ago that 92% of students are using ChatGPT, and it's AI. And I thought that it's something which has taken over. We can't actually stop it, but we have to embrace it. So while AI, many would say it's a curse, I think it's a blessing as well. We can use it to tackle the climate crisis. We can collect data, right? And we can come up with constructive policies to make a difference for people on the move. We can invest in strengthening early warning systems. We can focus on planned relocation. If national governments realize that this is one of the most pressing issues we see today, I think people can unite, countries can unite, regions can unite, and we can solve the climate crisis we see today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll take any questions if you have.
We'll have the question and answer session at the end. The next speaker is Shahzar Shah, Syed Shahzar Shah. He is a researcher at our institute, and he has worked on forced migration. He is going to speak on displacement as a weapon, the politics of forced migration in the MENA region. Shahzar?
Distinguished speakers and guests, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to let me speak on the topic of displacement, a global crisis that only seems to grow more dire by the day. Displacement, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, is often described in humanitarian discourse as an unfortunate consequence of conflict. It is presented as a regrettable but inevitable result of war, with civilians caught in the crossfire, communities shattered by forces beyond their control. But what if this framing itself is a distortion? What if displacement is not merely the fallout of war, but one of its primary objectives? In the past 2 decades, a consistent pattern has emerged in the MENA region: the forced movement of civilian populations. It is a strategic instrument, a weapon wielded to redraw political maps, break the backs of dissenting populations, and establish long-term control without prolonged occupation. From the demographic reshaping of Syria to the ethnic cleansing in Sudan, from the calculated fragmentation of Yemen to the generational erasure in Palestine, we are witnessing the normalization of engineered displacement. This is not mere conjecture. According to international legal standards, specifically the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, forced population transfer can constitute a crime against humanity. Intent, in legal contexts, does not require an explicit written order. It may be inferred through consistent patterns and outcomes, especially when displacement is followed by repopulation, property seizure, or deliberate prevention of return. We must now move beyond treating displacement solely as a humanitarian crisis. It must be understood and addressed as a political weapon employed to reshape regions and societies through coercion. Now, to understand the different ways that displacement is employed, we begin in Syria. Since the outbreak of civil war in 2011, all the way to its recent conclusion, over 13.5 million Syrians, nearly 60% of the country's pre-war population, have been displaced. Of these, almost 7 million remain internally displaced, while another 6 million have fled the country, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, what is particularly revealing is the method and sequence of displacement. The Assad regime, supported by Russia and Iran, executed a strategy of siege warfare, indiscriminate aerial bombardment, and starvation blockades, followed by forced evacuation. Cities like Aleppo became laboratories for displacement. Under the guise of reconciliation agreements, opposition-aligned populations were removed from these strategic urban centers. Many were relocated to different provinces. Subsequently, these areas were repopulated with communities aligned with or loyal to the regime. In practice, these were forced evacuations following brutal siege warfare and indiscriminate aerial bombardments. Cities were subjected to starvation blockades, denial of humanitarian aid, and sustained bombing campaigns. When these areas finally surrendered, populations were bussed out, while loyalists were moved in or allowed to return. This strategy served multiple objectives: militarily neutralizing opposition-held areas, punishing dissenting communities, and repopulating key cities with more politically loyal residents. Human Rights Watch has extensively documented numerous forced displacement campaigns, often amounting to forcible transfer under international law. These were not just battlefield necessities. They were acts of political architecture, redrawing the map of Syria in favor of regime consolidation. And now we turn to Sudan, a crisis that has tragically returned to global neglect despite its magnitude. Since April 2023, fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces has displaced over 10 million people, according to the International Organization for Migration. That is nearly a fifth of the country's population, the largest internal displacement crisis in the world today. But again, this is not mere fallout. The RSF, descended from the infamous Janjaweed militias and supported by external actors such as the UAE, they were responsible for the Darfur genocide in the early 2000s. And now they have been orchestrating ethnically targeted campaigns, particularly against the Masalit and other non-Arab groups in West Darfur. Entire villages have been razed. Mass rapes have been documented. Water sources have been poisoned, a tactic designed not only to kill, but to prevent return. In just a few months, entire districts have been emptied of their indigenous populations. These acts are not incidental. They are the continuation of a long history of weaponized displacement in Sudan, from the South Sudan Civil War to the scorched earth campaigns in the Nuba Mountains. And they are being carried out today with impunity. The infrastructure to support those displaced simply does not exist. Over 75% of IDPs in Sudan, IDPs being internally displaced persons, are living without consistent access to clean water, shelter, or medical care. Mental health services are virtually non-existent. Doctors Without Borders says that there are significant gaps in trauma-related treatment in key displacement camps. Now, once again, this is not just humanitarian devastation, it is permanent demographic restructuring. Now, in Yemen, Displacement is both the means and the end of a multifaceted conflict. Since 2015, Yemen's civil war has displaced more than 4.5 million people, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The conflict, often described in geopolitical shorthand as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, has had deeply localized and community-level consequences. The Houthi movement, backed by Iran, has strategically expelled Sunni tribes from northern strongholds. The Saudi-led coalition, in turn, has bombed civilian infrastructure in Houthi-controlled zones. The result is not just a scattering of populations, but the intentional breaking of tribal networks and local governance structures that historically mediated Yemeni society. The economic impact is catastrophic. The World Bank notes a steep contraction in GDP per capita and the erosion of basic state functions. Over 80% of the population now lives in poverty. Access to education and employment among the displaced has dropped immensely. The protraction of displacement ensures that even if the war ends, the country's future, economically, politically, and socially, will remain fractured. Now, Palestinian displacement, unlike many cases in the region, is not a crisis of recent origin. It is a defining and continuous element of Palestinian identity. The 1948 Nakba, during which over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled their homes, established the precedent. But recent military campaigns have escalated displacement into what human rights organizations now openly describe as forcible transfer. Now, since October 2023, Israeli bombardment of Gaza has displaced more than 1.7 million people, over 80% of the territory's population. The UN Relief and Works Agency reports that a large number of schools have been turned into shelters, many facing dire conditions, including lack of clean water and sanitation. Entire neighborhoods have been leveled. Medical centers have been targeted. Even so-called safe zones have repeatedly come under fire, leading experts at the UN and Amnesty International to question whether this is indicative of population engineering. Palestinians have lived under siege, occupation, or exile for generations. But today's displacement, with the added pressure of settler expansion in the West Bank, points towards a strategy not of security enforcement, but of spatial domination. But to speak only of local actors would be disingenuous. Western powers have also played a significant role in displacement in this region. The 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States and its allies displaced millions. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime unleashed a wave of sectarian violence and forced population transfer that still continues today. In Libya, NATO's 2011 intervention destabilized the country, leading to protracted civil conflict and the displacement of more than 800,000 people. Entire towns were ethnically cleansed, with residents still barred from returning. And also, once again, Israel, in the case of Palestine, Israel is not acting alone. It enjoys the unequivocal and enthusiastic support of the United States. Displacement is not solely caused, then, by regimes within the region. It is a tool that has been wielded by global powers in pursuit of geopolitical goals, often without accountability or long-term planning. Now, displacement is not just a moment of crisis as it happens. It is a mechanism that ruptures every layer of society. Now, once uprooted, people lose access to employment, education, and healthcare.
You've got 3 minutes.
Kinship networks are destroyed, local economies collapse, informal social safety nets, extended families, tribal elders, and neighborhood cooperatives are rendered irrelevant. Children born in displacement are at severe risk of becoming part of a lost generation. According to UNICEF, about 30 million displaced children in the region do not attend formal schooling, and the psychological toll is immense. Fundamentally, displacement creates intergenerational poverty. Entire families grow up without land ownership, without documentation, and often without a legal nationality. That is not just a humanitarian problem, it is a deliberate silencing of a political constituency. But I also want to quickly talk about another dimension to this crisis, one that speaks not to displacement itself, but the way the world responds to it, and that is the double standard of international compassion. So when war broke out in Ukraine back in 2022, 7 million refugees were received across Europe with a speed, dignity, and generosity that reflected the best of humanitarian ideals. Borders were opened, resources were mobilized, and integration programs were fast-tracked, and rightly so. But for other refugees, such as from the Middle East, that door remains closed. Many are stranded at the borders of the same nations that welcomed Ukrainians. Some are met not with housing and healthcare, but with barbed wire, detention, and deportation.
1 minute.
International humanitarian law is clear. The forcible transfer of civilian populations is prohibited under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court also defines it as a war crime, yet enforcement remains elusive. Only a handful of individuals have ever been prosecuted for displacement-related crimes. Powerful actors are shielded by geopolitical alliances. However, alternative mechanisms exist. Countries can pursue universal jurisdiction, as seen in Germany's prosecution of Syrian officials. Independent commissions can name and document abuses. Sanctions can target individuals, not just states. And reconstruction aid can be conditioned on reintegration guarantees. The Middle East and North Africa is not a region of war. It is a region of movement, not the free movement of people, goods, and ideas, but the coerced movement of millions who are being systematically disempowered. Displacement is no longer a side effect of conflict. It is its structure. It is the infrastructure of modern authoritarianism. And unless we acknowledge this, unless we name it, define it, and confront it, we risk normalizing it. Worse, we risk being complicit in it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Well done. Well done, Sherry. Thank you so much, Sherry. The next, there are two other speakers. It's a joint presentation by Dr. Arjumand Banu Kazmi from the University of Oslo. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Law. And Dr. Maya Janmir, who also comes from the University of Oslo. She is Professor of International Migration Law at the Faculty of Law in the university. And they are going to make a presentation on the 1951 Refugee Convention, assessing its relevance today. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Dr. Masuma and the entire Institute team for welcoming us here to this wonderful conference this weekend. It's really been a great honor to be here. Thank you so much, sir. It's really been a great honor to be here this weekend, and I really look forward to now presenting some of the research that we are undertaking on international refugee law as part of the 5-year Beyond project at the University of Oslo in Norway. So, 4 years before the Bandung Conference, in 1951, the Refugee Convention was negotiated in Geneva to provide protection to refugees, but not all refugees. The convention was Eurocentric at its core, even though states like Lebanon, Iraq, Pakistan, and India actually did take part in the creation of the convention and the actual drafting of the convention. But it was only in 1967 that a protocol removed the geographic and temporal limitation that was embedded within the original convention. Despite the global extension of the convention's application, there are many problematic issues that remain, and my colleague Eric has already mentioned some of these today in his presentations. I would say that we are at a critical juncture in the development and application of international refugee law. On the one hand, the continued relevance of the convention has come under doubt. There are, as you know, reoccurring debates about the end of the global refugee protection regime. We see how many states that are signatory to the convention, that are party to the convention, most starkly in Europe, I would say, continuously violate core refugee protection principles. And on the other hand, major refugee hosting countries in several regions of the world are not parties to the convention nor to the protocol. And we see some of these on this map here, where we see the dark turquoise color that's indicating the non-signatoriness of these states. So in consequence of this, we see how mainstream scholarship and practice often view these non-signatory states as an exception to international refugee law, meaning that they are places where international refugee law is neither applicable nor relevant. So in the field of international refugee law, for example, we speak of these states as exceptional to refugee law. It's not applicable, it's not relevant. At present, 46 UN member and observer states are not party to the convention nor to its protocol. And these states are, as we can see on the map, mainly found in the Middle East, which is the region that I am most familiar with, and in South and Southeast Asia. But we also see them in other parts of the globe. They include, for example, Eritrea, Libya, Mongolia, Cuba, and Guyana. And this complexity then, where we have states that are hosting large number of refugees, but which are still non-signatory to the convention, is actually at the heart of the Beyond project, where we wish to empirically rather than normatively explore how these refugee hosting states engage with international refugee law. And our research so far shows that the Refugee Convention not only continues to be relevant also in states where you wouldn't expect them to be, but also that it plays important roles in shaping responses to refugees in many non-signatory states. And I will explore some of this with you shortly. But I just also do want to point out that we're not seeking to make a normative argument here about whether or not states should or should not become a party to the convention, or whether the convention is appropriate in today's world. That's a separate discussion. We come to the discussion about the Refugee Convention from a slightly different angle. So in our project then, we are rather trying to make this empirically based argument about the role of the international refugee regime in states that are non-signatory to the convention. So in other words, how does the Refugee Convention matter, if at all, in these states that are not party to it? So in an effort then to bring non-signatory states into the ongoing debates about the past and the future of international refugee law, we focus on a number of questions. I won't read all today, but just to take a couple of examples. So how does the Refugee Convention impact on and inform relevant laws and practices of non-signatory states? To what extent and how do non-signatory states engage with international refugee law more broadly conceived? So here, in the case of Pakistan, for example, we can think of Pakistan's leading role in developing what is known as the Global Compact on Refugees. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the really leading diplomatic role that Pakistan took in that regard. Not to mention Pakistan's role in the UNHCR Executive Committee, where Pakistan has been very engaged for decades. So what are the reasons beyond non-ratification of the convention, etc.? So by exploring these questions, we really aim to bring these non-signatory states into the ongoing debates about the past and the future of the convention and of international refugee law more generally. A few words on some of our tentative findings, because our research is still ongoing. But first, the question of accession is far more complicated than we even thought when we started this project. So we have this intricate legal reality of ratification, accession, and succession, coupled then with colonial histories, mean that for some states, the question of accession is far from straightforward. To take a few examples, we have debunked the myth that South Asian states have continuously and unwaveringly refused to accede the Refugee Convention. This is something that is very strong in the narrative about South Asian states and the Convention. Through archival research, our PhD candidate Noreen Rahim, who's not with us here today, she has examined how in 1989, Bangladesh actually took a formal decision at the highest level to accede to the convention. This is little known. At the time, becoming a party to the convention made strategic sense to Bangladesh, and she unpacks why this is the case. In the end, however, the instrument of accession was never deposited to the UN, meaning that still today, Bangladesh is not a signatory to the convention. But non-signatory states are also not always stories of a refusal to commit to the instrument. So take Mauritius, for example. It is formally considered by the United Nations to not be a party to the convention, yet its Supreme Court in 2003 concluded that upon its independence from Great Britain in 1968, the country had indeed succeeded to the convention and that it was a party. So how do you deal with these diverging views where you have the Supreme Court of one state saying that it is a party and the UN saying that it is not? So we examine these processes of state succession, showing then how diverging doctrines and practices lead to this type of complicated situation. And just to take a third example here, look at the small island states of the Caribbean, Aruba and Curacao, who both have received large number of Venezuelan refugees and other migrants. They shared with Indonesia the experience of colonization by the Netherlands. However, where Indonesia's independence actually imbues it with autonomy to ratify international treaties, this is not the case for Aruba and Curacao, which lack legal personality and cannot therefore ratify treaties. So they couldn't become a party even if they wanted to. Another finding from our research is the prominent role of domestic courts. And here we were actually immensely surprised to see the extent to which domestic courts, including in Pakistan, actually engaged with the norms of the Refugee Convention. And they do this either actively or passively. So in some cases, the courts apply the convention to resolve the dispute before the court, but in other cases, the judges merely cite the relevant provisions of the convention without any further reasoning. But from our perspective, this type of engagement is significant in a context where you would expect that domestic courts do not engage with instruments that the country is not formally bound by. And Dr. Kazmi has explored the Pakistani court context in more detail, and I think you, Arjun, you will say more about how important advancements have been made on the domestic court front. So I will just hand over the floor to you to continue this.
Is it on? Yes. Thank you very much again for inviting me to speak at this forum. It is a privilege and honor to come here, to come to Karachi amongst Karachi University students and professors, where I was a student long time ago as well. Lebanon, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Turkey to assess the relevance of international refugee law in the non-signatory states context. So in this project, I obviously focus on Pakistan, and in the context of Pakistan, much like other country-specific projects, there are various lines of inquiries that I'm undertaking. However, here I'm focusing on the role of courts in terms of assessing the relevance of international refugee law, how Pakistani courts are engaging with international refugee law. The other lines of inquiries that I am looking at is how UNHCR and Pakistan relations have been for the last 45 years and more, but also how UNHCR is promoting the norms and principles of international refugee law in the universities here, most specifically with LUMS. So, but as I said here, I'll be talking about the role of courts. So in order to conduct this research, I was here for over 12 months between 2022 and 2023, sometime in 2024 as well. I did a lot of interviews with diplomats, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with Saffron and Commissionerate for Afghan refugees, refugees themselves, but also the professionals of UNHCR. And I also conducted archival research in Geneva, UNHCR headquarters. So I have wealth of information which I'm still trying to make sense of. So what is the context? And in order to understand why we are studying international refugee law and assessing its relevance, we need to obviously think about what is happening right now in Pakistan. Pakistan hosts one of the largest refugee populations in the world. Most of these are from Afghanistan, some 3 million according to the UNHCR data. It is a protracted situation since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. We have had score of refugees coming to Pakistan and staying here, and it's been 45 years. So that's why it's a protracted situation. Needless to say that we have a very large border between the two countries and historical ethnic affiliations. So in this context, UNHCR has held a mandate to protect refugees in Pakistan, to support the state of Pakistan. And the refugee agency began working in Pakistan soon after 1979. So again, the relationship between Pakistani state and UNHCR is also a protracted one, it's a long one. So, although Pakistan welcomed UNHCR's assistance throughout 1990s, it has had sort of, bumpy relationship with UNHCR. And that goes without saying for any such long partnership. Nevertheless, there are institutions and infrastructures that are in place, such as the Commissioner for Afghan Refugees under the Ministry of Saffron, which are there to support UNHCR and UNHCR supporting them to protect refugees. So when it comes to having domestic laws and policies on governing Afghan refugees and providing them fundamental rights and protection, we have an extremely thin and ambiguous layer of legal measures. The main legal text that we have is the Foreigners Act of 1946 of the colonial times, which is applied by the courts, local courts, on matters pertaining to the refugees. The act penalizes the illegal entry and stay of foreigners into the country. And that's the act which is applied to refugees. In the absence of any national refugee law or policy or the international law, what we have is the Foreigners Act. And what we also have is the Constitution of Pakistan. The Constitution of Pakistan guarantees fundamental rights to all persons living in the country. And that's very important for us to note right now. So I can, when I move on to the courts, then you will see the reference of that. And although the case law is limited, we can say that high courts in Pakistan in the past made references to these commitments, to the Constitution of Pakistan, but also to the Foreigners Act. And what I would argue later on in this presentation is that the high courts have been instrumental in terms of recognizing refugees as refugees. So international law also applies. International law applies not because of the 1951 Refugee Convention, because we are not signatory to that convention, but it applies for the conventions that we are signatory of. So for instance, the ICCPR, Convention Against Torture, many other CEDAW, CRC, which is a Convention on the Rights of the Child. There are provisions in those conventions that Pakistan is a signatory to that apply to the protection of refugees. But what we have these days is a policy impasse. In October 2023, the government of Pakistan issued an illegal foreigners repatriation plan, which is called IFRP, and it was introduced to expel undocumented Afghan refugees. Undocumented refugees or undocumented illegal persons in Pakistan. We know for the fact that although the government focuses and says that it applies to all persons residing in Pakistan illegally, it is mainly the Afghan refugees that have been forcefully deported from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And Karachi, you might remember in December 2023, there was a big incident or big issue around detaining lots of Afghan refugees, including children, and putting them. This picture I took here in the civil court, where a pro bono lawyer is trying to help Afghan refugees that are caught and they're brought to the court, chained, right? So yes, so this policy came in, and there was a crackdown on Afghan refugees. There is still a crackdown of Afghan refugees. By this month, Pakistan has expelled 861,000 and more individuals from Pakistan to Afghanistan. So it's a big crisis. What the speaker before me was talking about, the forced expulsion, the panel before, can we argue, or can we actually see it also as a form of genocide, legally maybe not, but the spirit it seems to me is the same. And the final phase will see an estimated 1.4 million Afghan refugees registered with UNHCR to be called on to leave Pakistan. The current deadline is 30th June and is fast approaching. So with that, a very quick note on Pakistan and UNHCR. Since 1980s, they are working. But the three challenges that were defined by the first chief of mission in Pakistan still remain: the magnitude of the refugee crisis, the complexity of the logistics, and the nature of the security situation. For that, Pakistan and UNHCR have two fundamental agreements. I'm not going to talk about those agreements in full, but there are agreements in place. So the case of Rahil Azizi is a very interesting one. The judgment came out on the 19th of June, 2023. I think it was 2023. Let me just see it. 2023, yes, I'm right. Yeah. And here, the Islamabad High Court gave a relief to an Afghan woman who was seeking refuge in Pakistan. She had fled from Afghanistan after the withdrawal of NATO forces, and she has crossed the border illegally because she didn't really have the documents. And she couldn't have the documents. So she went to the police station, declared herself as a person seeking refuge. And since we don't really have any laws in place, the Foreigners Act the police applied the Foreigners Act, and she was detained, spent 9 months in prison in Adiala jail, and for nothing, she didn't really commit any crime. She was just fleeing persecution.
You're running out of time.
Yeah, just 1 minute. And this person was helped by UNHCR and supplementing partners, and the court gave the decision in favor of her, arguing that Pakistan, although the convention doesn't apply, nevertheless, non-refoulement, the principle of non-refoulement, customary international law applies, and other international conventions also apply, which means that the court has used the argument that Pakistan has the obligations towards the refugee protection, even where the Pakistan is not a signatory to the 1951 convention. And I think that's the main takeaway from us, that the high courts in Pakistan are presenting themselves as a forum as an institution where the refugee rights are being protected vis-a-vis the draconian laws and policies of the state of Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Arjuman and Janman. I will now open the floor to discussion, and if there are any questions.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is the whole panel, that there are laws of refugees, protection and resettlement and all. But I wonder, is there any law if the native country does not take back those refugees after being expelled from the country which is hosting? Like, for example, the Afghan refugees, they're sent back, but Afghanistan is very reluctant to accept them. So, is there any law which protects them in that case?
As far as, thank you very much. Shall I?
Please.
As far as my knowledge, I'm aware, I think there is no law, but basically they are expected to obviously accept. But that also depends on the conditions, the political, economic, and other conditions in the country as well. It's not, I don't think that they are not accepting the people who are going back. What they are also arguing is that they have dire economic situations as well, and also asking the state of Pakistan to do that in a sort of phased manner, so they are not inundated by a lot of people seeking help.
My name is Farooq Azam Memon. I am a retired civil servant. My question is from Dr. Arjuman Banu Kazmi. The impression which I have got from your presentation is that these refugees, particularly from Afghanistan, who have come and settled here since long, particularly in urban since say, Karachi, and they should not be touched. And since 2021, there is now a settled government, somewhat a settled government, which is recognized by even now USA. But still, we shouldn't do anything about repatriation of those refugees. See, historically in Sindh particularly, there are pockets of people coming from Afghanistan particularly, in rural Sindh, in Shikarpur, in the rural of Hyderabad, General Muhammad Khan, there are areas where people from Kandahar and other parts of Afghanistan have been settling since centuries. So nobody would like, because these are warmer areas and people come from the cooler areas in north, they would like to settle here. Of course, it is a refugees. There has been persecution in Afghanistan, but normally people whosoever comes here, they don't want to go back. So if we have to be so much friendly for refugees, as you call, then there would be no one to go back. So the resources here, they are of course to be. Sorry, ma'am.
Do you have a question?
My question is that why should we be so much friendly for people coming and settling here?
No, we don't have to. Is there any other question?
Thank you, Sarfraz Korejo, once again.
Too many times.
Thank you. It's all your generosity, Chair. My question is related with Mr. Shahriar on the basis of a very fine book written by Eddie Kaufman and John Davis on citizens' diplomacy. In one of the chapters, they define the war and peace. So as far as the war, they have defined the three categories or the stages of war. One is the damage, once we are at the war situation. Then we have the displacement, then finally the death. The concept of the 3Ds. So I'm just linking this with the citizens' diplomacy. Also, I would like to make a request to the August House that everyone is talking either whether the spirit of Bandung has been ended or it's over or it's alive. So the voice must be from Karachi, the people's sark like people's Bandung from Karachi. And madam, you deserve as the founding soul of this people's Bandung. So my question is regarding the role of citizens' diplomacy in mitigating conflict, especially the displacement. So this is all from me.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody want to answer that? Sharia, briefly, please.
Yeah. So the way I see it is that I think that it can start here at this institute, because I think academic institutions must also play a role. I think that we should reframe displacement studies not as passive humanitarian reflection, but as an active analysis of structural violence. We like scholars and institutions, I think that we can play a role to update the language we use. That displacement is not always collateral. Sometimes it is. I'm not denying that. But a lot of the times, as we see the way these patterns build over time, and like the outcomes of these patterns of displacement, we can see that it's deliberate. So if we treat it that way and frame it that way, then I think then that's a good start, because things tend to move very slowly, I think, in the international relations. So
One more question before we wind up.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for an insightful discussion. My question is to the entire panel. When concerning displacement, genocide, and even the refugee crisis, it is no secret that news agencies and social media play a role in either showing, hiding, exaggerating, or downplaying these issues. Regarding this, how do we use mass media to correctly address these issues? Or how do we transform mass media to solve these issues?
Would you like to reply, Najima? Or Jan?
Do you want to? Thanks so much. I'll just be very brief. I think one of the most important things that media needs to do is be wary of the terminology that's being used, whether or not we're talking about the term genocide or the term refugee, about perhaps using terms such as undocumented migration and not illegal migration. So I think just being aware of the terminology and not spreading misinformation is the key in that regard.
Chair,
I would say I agree. That's it.
Chair, found all the presentation most informative and interesting. I wanted to apologize for my ignorance, but is there any provision in current global law where deliberate demographic change is engineered as an instrument of state policy? And I'm not saying this as a parochial Pakistani. What we are witnessing in Indian-occupied Kashmir is a deliberate intrusion in order to disempower the original Muslim majority. Is there any provision in international law that covers this kind of engineered displacement, which is not violent ostensibly, but has a malign purpose, a malevolent purpose?
Yeah. Okay. I'm not familiar with the entire of sort of international law framework, but I think the question that you are asking is about state sovereignty and respecting state sovereignty and respecting the boundaries. And I'm sure that there must be provisions in Vienna Convention, various different conventions. So maybe it's a matter of looking into that convention and yeah. But it's a valid question, because obviously that will also lead to, or could lead to, displacement of a different kind, right? Thank you.
One more question, Mr. Zalmi.
Thank you. On the demographic engineering, what you're alluding to in Kashmir, I think this is quite common across different states. For instance, in Indonesia, the Javanese have been transmigrated as a matter of policy to spread across different places, right? And also at the moment in Myanmar, where the land was vacated by the Rohingya who survived the genocide, the local Buddhist Rakhines, who are collaborating, supporting local community, they are moving into there. And then the same in Nazi Germany. The East was supposed to be the living space. There's a German term for living space. And so I think this is all a part of the, the state demographic engineering.
I am Sikandar Mehdi. My question is to the panel. What prevents the South Asian states from signing the convention?
What prevents?
Well, there's nothing that really prevents these states from signing the convention if they want to. But I think maybe your question is more, what are the reasons why South Asian states do not want to ratify these treaties? And what we're seeing in the Beyond Project is that the reasons are very complex. So if we just compare to the Middle East region, where for many years there has been an idea, a narrative that Middle Eastern states have not wanted to ratify the 1951 Refugee Convention because of the Palestinian issue. But if we go back to the drafting of the convention, the concerns of these Middle Eastern states when it comes to the keeping and retaining the special status of Palestinian refugees was actually incorporated both in the UNHCR statute and in the 1951 Refugee Convention. So more recent studies on the Middle Eastern states have seen that there are a number of other reasons that really don't go well with this, the Palestinian narrative as being the reason why these states have not ratified. And one of these reasons is actually conveniency, that it's very convenient for many states to leave the entire issue of refugees and caring for refugees to an organization like UNHCR. But there are a number of other reasons in that context. When it comes to South Asia, I would say that the reasons for not ratifying the convention are equally complex. There's not one single reason. We cannot only say that it's about the Eurocentric past, but there are a number of other factors. Maybe anyone else for the panel would like to fill in. Arjun, I don't know if you have.
Very quickly, from my research in Pakistan, for instance, the main, what I'm getting, well, nobody answers this question quite straightforwardly. So it has to be interpreted by the researcher, by myself. So my interpretation is that Pakistan has done a lot to in hosting refugees, Afghan refugees in particular, for the last 45 years. And they like to see themselves as doing a friendly, kind favor so that they can use it, to negotiate, to work more funds, but also work in partnership with UNHCR. If they do sign the convention, then it won't be a favor, it will be an obligation. And international law obligations are tough to report on. So, so that's my sense. But again, nobody answers this question quite specifically. In the literature, there is a lot about Eurocentric past of the convention, which I think it's an equally valid argument. Thanks.
I'm going to now wind up this session.
My bad.
I want to thank the speakers, all four of them, for excellent presentations on this subject. We can, if we like, relate it to the spirit of Bandung. Eric spoke about displacement drivers, floods, droughts, climate crises. He also pointed out that this could interact with genocide. He spoke about climate migrants and interactions with political and economic instability. He has predicted that Karachi will have 3 million climate migrants in the future, but he also referred to the cultural loss which is involved. Shahriar's thesis has always been that displacement is not some kind of collateral damage, but it is a strategic instrument by certain powers. And he has referred to Syria, Sudan, Gaza, Yemen as instances of engineered displacement. He has also said that it should be understood as a political weapon, and he has given figures and data for displacement and forced civil transfers, and also talked about the double standard of, as he called it, international compulsion. Arjumand and Maya have given a very excellent presentation of their ongoing research on the Refugee Convention, from which I'm sure we have learned a lot. the future of international refugee law. They have also talked about Pakistan's diplomatic efforts and its leading role in some instances with respect to the law. I was interested to learn that Bangladesh has acceded to the convention, but it still has to be, it's still pending, I believe. Is it?
A formal decision was ostensibly taken at the highest level in 1989, but the instrument was never deposited.
And they have also talked about the prominent role of domestic courts in this respect, and that how Pakistani courts are engaged directly or indirectly with international refugee law. I do not know to what extent what I am going to say now fits in with the main theme of people on the move. But I'm going to make a small reference to modern day slavery, especially with respect to people who are trafficked and they are therefore on the move. Modern day slavery exists or prevails in one form or the other in almost every country of the world. It is estimated that about 50 million people are trapped in it worldwide, and that roughly 1/4 of modern slaves are children. So when people are treated as slaves, they are chattels, and they have no control over their lives. The forms of modern slavery are human trafficking. Through violence, victims are forced into prostitution or forced labor. Even marriage against one's will is considered a kind of trafficking. Forced labor, bonded labor, we are familiar with that in our country, when people can't get out of the debts which they can't repay. A very famous American scholar has written, modern slavery occurs when a person is under the control of another person who applies violence and force to maintain that control, and the goal of that control is exploitation. There are some countries where slavery is even now quite rampant. I don't know to what extent it's correct, but they say that in Mauritania, about 90,000 people are enslaved. And as I said, you know, there are rituals like bride buying, that's a kind of slavery, child soldiers in Africa, and you may be interested in knowing that there are 2 films on this which you might want to see when you have time. One is called 13th, that is 13th, and the other one is called A Woman Captured. And with that, thank you very much for being present in this session.